Ghost of Tsushima is not an RPG, but it does give the player one big choice to make towards the end of the game, which really epitomises Jin Sakai's journey and the challenges he faces throughout the game. I don't feel the need to spoil what that decision is or any other story details here, because it's easy enough to talk about without doing so. But suffice it to say that while the choice doesn't broadly affect the shape of your playthrough, it does feel like a pretty important decision in the context. At the same time though, it represents a bit of a missed opportunity inside the game, given how little impact your decisions have prior to that moment. At its core, Ghost of Tsushima offers a mostly linear story centered on the samurai warrior Jin Sakai, as he almost single-handedly takes on the Mongol Empire after they invade the island of Tsushima. By the way, I apologise for any dodgy pronunciation in this video and, while I'm here, any other video I've made or will ever make. Anyway, while he fights to save his home, Jin is also battling with the samurai code he was raised to follow, as he adopts less honourable tactics in order to outmaneuver and outthink his enemy. This internal conflict weaves its way throughout the story and is central to Jin's adventure, before eventually coming to a head in that final decision you make. While it's integral to the story though, it's regularly underutilised in the moment-to-moment gameplay, even though they lay the groundwork for it to feel a lot more important. The meat and potatoes here, the stuff you'll mostly be doing, is engaging with some seriously fun and well-considered melee combat. Each to their own of course, but it's easily up there with some of the most fun close quarters combat I've experienced in any game. And for what it's worth, I say that as someone who is terrible at Souls-like games, but still enjoys a challenge so long as it feels like I can survive most encounters. Point being, I thought the game was almost always fun. But while it seems to present the player with a choice of whether they want to play as the samurai or the ghost, it really insists that you be a little bit of both. To be clear, I really think Ghost of Tsushima is a fantastic game altogether. Partly that's because it's so consistently polished and beautiful. Not only the world, but the character models and the fabrics and the way it all flows and works together. It looks and feels about as good as anyone could reasonably hope for. And though I'm sure it's not entirely accurate, it seems to do a good job at representing this era of Japan's history. Or at the very least has respect for that history and the country. The other obvious and oft mentioned feather in its cap then is the combat. It's easy enough to grasp, it feels fast and fluid, and it adds enough abilities and layers of depth throughout the journey that it remains enjoyable for the length of the game, or at least until you've unlocked every ability that interests you. Beyond being simply fun though, the combat, on a surface level at least, helps define the distinction between the samurai and ghost ethos in gameplay. Firstly, the divide is established broadly as stealthy combat meaning ghost and head-on combat equaling samurai. It's not quite that simple though, because each style also has its own unique skill tree, with several unlockable techniques which cross over between stealth and regular combat. And they don't all feel like they make total sense, to be honest. Then again, they don't actually need to, because this samurai ghost distinction isn't really meant to be an either-or decision that the player makes. Because the game doesn't actually accommodate branching pathways throughout the story, characters will basically treat you the same way no matter how you choose to play. Besides that, the game forces you to play with either samurai or ghost tactics at various points throughout the main story. And then there's a bunch of dialogue and several cutscenes where, once again, no matter how you've played, Jin's divergence from the samurai code will be questioned and judged, especially by his uncle, Lord Shimura. So it's sort of like the game sets up this choice for the player as Jin to make, while knowing full well that the story will be the same until that decision at the very end. And I think that's because the game is basically certain that you're going to use a combination of tactics to fight against the Mongol invasion. And it's probably right too, because the developers have made it incredibly difficult and unrewarding, not only for the player to commit to one or the other, but to even know quite what is allowed as a samurai and what isn't. The black powder bomb is considered a ghost weapon, for example, but the explosive arrow is a mythic ability which is allowed as a samurai? Or is it? And then the archery upgrade path comes under ghost abilities, and so too do the standoff techniques, neither of which seem like they should be exclusively ghost abilities, right? If you ignored the ghost techniques for your whole game, not only would it not make a material difference to the story, it would also prevent you from using several abilities which seem totally appropriate for a samurai playstyle. And playing just with the ghost techniques, on the other hand, would lock you out of several pretty essential combat abilities. Add to that while the regular samurai combat is fantastic, the stealth gameplay here is not especially good. It's serviceable, but clearly not fully fleshed out. It's a bit basic and janky, and the enemy AIs don't respond especially well. I think the developers know all this too, so they don't make it especially easy to take a stealthy approach in most combat encounters. And the standoffs make stealth even less appealing, as they're cinematic and tense and allow you to start combat with an advantage much quicker than if you were using stealth takedowns. All that to say that this game really doesn't expect the player to stick strictly to one approach. It doesn't even really suggest it's a possibility, honestly. Jin's journey in Ghost of Tsushima is a slow separation from the ways of the samurai. It's about shelving honor and strict moral codes in order to do what's right and necessary to win the war and protect his island and his people. You can, in the end, choose to return to the samurai way, at least to some extent, but it takes a lot more work in the player's head to fit that ending into the story that Jin Sakai has lived through. The choice is there though, and that is at the very least interesting. But before I get into that, it's worth discussing what else there is to experience in this game, because it isn't just combat. There's plenty else here on the island of Tsushima that is part of the journey, even if much of it arguably muddies Jin's internal conflict even more. When Ghost of Tsushima first released, it was quite rightly compared to the Assassin's Creed games, especially since fans of that series had been begging Ubisoft for a game set in feudal Japan ever since Ubisoft's globe-trotting intentions for the franchise were made clear. Even though Ubisoft are now finally making a game in that vein, they were well and truly beaten to it by Sony and Sucker Punch. And it's fair to say that Ghost of Tsushima has set a standard which, in many ways, Ubisoft will struggle to compete with. The Ubisoft comparison is most relevant, of course, when looking at the open world map of the island of Tsushima and the numerous activities and side quests available to the player. Though you're not climbing any towers here to survey the local area, the way the game sets up its side content feels very close to the Ubisoft playbook, for better or worse. On that note, there are a great number of Mongol settlements which you can fight your way through in order to liberate an area and eventually free the whole island. These encounters allow you to play around with the combat, usually in any way you like, and will clear the fog from the map, but they get pretty repetitive pretty quickly if you try to do all of them. Beyond that, there are several categories of activities which vary in quality but are all at least unique to this game and the world. I greatly appreciated the number of these in-game which are not combat focused and offered genuine moments of respite from intense battles. Sometimes you'll follow a bird to a shrine or a fox to its den, Or maybe you'll chop through some bamboo, or perhaps take a bath and reflect on stuff. My favourite activity, by far, is the haiku writing game. It genuinely engages a different part of the brain and is amusingly unpredictable. Part of me wishes there were more options for creating truly terrible haikus rather than nonsensical musings, but still. It's probably the only side activity that I actively sought out, but I still didn't do all of them because there's just too many and too much traversal required to find them all. Your mileage may vary, but as much as I enjoyed the game, I didn't want to do everything. That is kind of the beauty of an open world game like this though. The right person with the right game can enjoy every corner of the map for hundreds of hours. But if someone else just ignores the side stuff and sticks to the main story, they can still have a good time. Not everyone will want to engage with the side content here, and it's mostly just flavour anyway, but some people will love it. The problem I actually have with the side content here is that in the context of the story, these activities usually feel like weird tonal shifts. Even when I enjoyed them, it doesn't feel like most of the activities here flow well with the main story, especially in the later half. Nor do they explicitly tie in to Jin's ghost samurai dichotomy. Really, it made me wonder what this game would look like if it was just the main story and a few side quests. Arguably, it would be a lot more focused and well paced. This problem definitely isn't unique to this game and this open world, but the urgency of the main quest definitely conflicts with the frivolous side activities in a very noticeable way here. And those side activities don't feel well balanced with Jin's internal conflict. After playing through several of these activities in a row to find new outfits and weapons, the funniest thing to me was that I briefly forgot all about the ghost samurai conflict and the invasion of the Mongol Empire, and just thought that Jin Sakai was a cool dude who enjoyed hanging out with foxes and taking long baths. I'll add that I don't have much to say about the side quests in the game, except that while the character tales are well worth doing as they tie into the story quite nicely, most of the others suffer from the same problem of feeling a bit repetitive depending on how you pace them, and they can also feel like confusing tonal shifts depending on where you are in the game's story. Also, while I mentioned that several of the main quests force you into a samurai or ghost playstyle, a lot of the side quests basically do the same thing. And they don't contribute meaningfully to Jin's internal conflict either, leaving you potentially distracted when that final decision comes.
A lone pebble alters fate. Drowning and alone.
Throughout the length of the game, you're presented with dialogue choices, style choices, and gameplay choices, but none of these decisions result in any kind of branching outcomes in the story. At best, they add flavour, but again, this isn't an RPG, and so that's fine. When you reach the end of the game though, you do have to make a decision which affects the story, and as I said before, that choice really epitomises Jin's and the player's struggle over the extent of his loyalty to the samurai code. There is some degree of nuance here, but in essence you're presented with a single choice. Either to respect and return to the samurai way, or to dismiss the code and embrace the mantle of Ghost of Tsushima. By the way, if I had to guess what the canon ending was for this game, which again is called Ghost of Tsushima, I'd guess it's the ending where you embrace the mantle of Ghost of Tsushima, rather than the ending where you stop being the Ghost of Tsushima. The important thing to note about this final decision is that your gameplay choices throughout your playthrough don't decide for you. You're able to make this decision completely independent of the way you've played up to that point. So you could make every effort to stick to the samurai code and then behave apparently dishonorably in the end. Or you could stealth your way through the entire game as a ghost and then decide suddenly that you're going to be faithful to the code. So even though this decision is directly related to a gameplay choice the game seems to offer, it is not in any way influenced by your playstyle before that point. And I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing. I'm a big fan of immersive Sims style games where, rather than making choices along a dialogue tree, you're presented with several unique options to handle a situation, and your gameplay choices can have a cumulative effect on the outcome of the story, if only in a subtle way. Think Dishonored and how taking a more lethal approach increases the overall chaos level, which in turn increases the amount of rats on the streets, and eventually results in the player getting the bad ending for the game. Meanwhile, a non-lethal approach gives you the good ending. This works extremely well and feels great in Dishonored, but I don't think that executing an ending which feels truly dictated by gameplay choices is especially easy to do. I think back on BioShock, which I think is a masterpiece aside from the final boss battle and the two endings. You're allowed to harvest just one little sister and still get the good ending, but any more than that and the ending will insist that you are pure evil. Which is fair enough, I guess, but honestly, no matter which ending you get here, it doesn't feel quite right. That harvesting decision is so much more meaningful in the actual moment when you're weighing up your resources and deciding whether you can handle the next fight. I guess the endings are just handled in a more subtle way in Dishonored, and that's why it works for me where BioShock doesn't. The trouble with Ghost of Tsushima is that there aren't many situations where you're choosing either Ghost or Samurai, and it feels like an important decision to the character. Again though, that just seems to be the way the game is set up, whether we like it or not. There aren't those to harvest or not to harvest decision points along the way in Ghost of Tsushima. I understand, by the way, that playing as a Ghost or Samurai can affect the weather by increasing the frequency of storms if you take a more stealthy approach, but I can't say that I personally noticed that, and I doubt many other people would either. It's certainly not as obvious as an increase in rats on the street, but what it does show is that they are internally keeping track of those decisions you make. It just doesn't amount to anything meaningful. The most painful comparison I can make here is actually to Sucker Punch's previous games. Central to the entire Infamous series, which Sucker Punch are famously known for developing, are the choices of good or evil presented to the player. Each of the games has a karma system which results in either a good or bad ending depending on how you've played the game. And I think it's pretty well done in most of those games too. Knowing this makes it even weirder that Ghost of Tsushima is set up the way it is. The thing they did pretty well before, they sort of barely do at all in Ghost of Tsushima. It does have plenty of advantages over those Infamous games, but it loses out in that regard at least. I can't help but wonder then if earlier in development they had planned for these two paths to feel more distinct and to result in the two different endings. It would only make too much sense, right? And then I come back to wondering whether having these two more distinct playstyles would have improved the game or not.
Hold still.
Your Lord Sakai, slayer of the mighty Khan. My prayers have been answered.
Go. Be well.
The mere fact that the game presents this decision at the end of the game feels like a bit of an oddity. If there's no material difference throughout the game when the player drifts from one side to the other, then why does the choice need to be there at all? When the game basically insists that you play as the ghost, it makes that choice feel somewhat pointless. And yet, I'm still glad that it's there, because if nothing else, it forces the player to consider the themes of the story on a deeper level. Whether or not Sucker Punch originally intended for the player's actions to have a cumulative effect on the outcome of the story, it feels pretty clear that the tale we're actually told here is that of Jin's rejection of the samurai code and his becoming the legend that is the Ghost of Tsushima. Even though the choice was there in the end, it didn't feel appropriate to me, at least, to reconcile and return to the samurai path. But it might to some. I'm not sure in the end whether having that choice be made by the way you play would have increased or lessened the impact of the outcomes of the story. But I do think that the game would have worked just as well with only one ending. At the same time, I feel like more choices in a game can surely never be a bad thing. The freedom to succeed or fail at every stage is essentially what sets gaming apart from other mediums. And yet, a choice like the one presented at the end of Ghost of Tsushima, where it feels like there's a right and wrong decision based on the premise of the story and the character's journey, does have the potential to undermine what the story is trying to say in the first place. But what do you all think? Do you think a more proper separation of the ghost and samurai paths would have improved the game? Or do you think a more linear story with less open world stuff would have been better? Maybe you love the game exactly the way it is. Either way, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you'd like to hear me talk about more video game stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.